Hi everyone, this is Counseling 2250, Robinson Chapter 11, People of Jewish Descent. So first off is the dominant discourses about Jewish people, which are basically the stereotypes that people often think about when they think about Jewish people. The first one is calculating, miserly. Miserly basically means like cheap and kind of like stingy and thrifty and not like, willing to spend money, and kind of grouchy. Pushy, greedy, entitled, wealthy, white, Jewish looking, which entails curly dark hair, brown eyes, and a Jewish nose. The Jewish nose is a reference to having a larger nose. Non-ethnic minority, Jewish nationalism. Nationalism basically means that you love your own country the most. You think it's the best. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but sometimes it can be a little bit too much, if you know what I mean. Religious, and then of course in charge and powerful. And obviously these are just stereotypes. I would disagree with most of them. I have Jewish friends, and this is really not a description of them, but for some reason over the generations, people decided that these are the stereotypical things they think about when they think about Jewish people. So let's talk a little bit about the history of migration and acculturation. All Jews have roots in the Middle East and North Africa. 2,007 years ago, in Mesopotamia, which is currently known as Iraq. Tremendous ethnic and religious diversity among Jews and Judaism in Africa. Throughout time, numerous Jews have been in search for a home due to being exiled or expelled. Exiled basically means kind of like kicked out of their own homes. The Spanish Inquisition in 1478 to the 1800s expelled from Spain. They lost their lives or converted to Catholicism. And that actually, you can see that in the history where, if you don't want to be persecuted for a certain thing, you just accept the dominant culture's, let's say religion in this case, or whatever. Many Jews practiced Judaism in private and kept their Judaism confined to the synagogue and maintained an acculturated identity. So what that basically means is even though they publicly say, oh yeah, I'm a Catholic now, at home, they still practice Jewish traditions and stuff like that without anyone knowing. And that was a means of survival, right? Because, if no one's going to hire you because you're a Jewish person, then now because you're a Catholic, they will hire you. They might still have those values. You can't just drop these values, like 100% and not be affected by it, especially if you're a person of faith or religion. So now let's talk a little about the American Jewry, which basically means like the different types of Jewish people in America. There's the Ashkenazi, which is a descendant of the Jews from German, French, and Eastern European ancestry. So this is the largest group in America, and they arrived in the 1800s to 1900s. The second part is the Sephardics, which are descendants of Jews from Spanish, Portuguese, North Africa, and Middle Eastern ancestry. First to arrive in America, and some of their traditions are still influencing Jewish American life today. Then there's also the Mizrahi, which is the descendants of Jews from North Africa and Middle East. So now, I don't know if you realize this, but when you have Jewish friends or you talk to people who are Jewish and they kind of let you know where they're from, this kind of helps you understand what region. Is it Europe? Is it Africa? Where is it that they're coming from? The person that you're talking to anyways. Sephardic Jews are the first colonists in 1654, and they came from Brazil to New Amsterdam, and New Amsterdam is now known as New York. The first Jewish congregation, the Shearith Israel, was founded in 1684 in New York. A really famous Jewish person named Emma Lazarus, Shearith Israeli, is this poem that she wrote called The New Colossus. And the New Colossus is basically, I believe, etched into the Statue of Liberty. And her famous lines from this poem is, she cries with silent lips, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of you teeming shore. So right there is a really well-known poem, and that is Emma Lazarus. Sephardic and Ashkenazi merchants lived in Newport, Rhode Island, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Charleston, South Carolina, and Savannah, Georgia. In the 1840s, Jews exited Germany and came to America due to persecution. Persecution basically means not being liked or loved because of who you are, usually. There are also restrictive laws and economic hardships. Famous American Jews. The Gimbel brothers are famous for their department store. You probably have heard of Saks, right? and then also their parades. The Macy's family. Obviously, I'm sure you've all bought clothes at Macy's. That's a classic American Jewish family. And Levi Strauss. And Levi Strauss is the man who invented denim jeans. You know, jeans like that you wear, the blue jeans. He's the one who created that design. Amazing, huh? In the 1880s, Eastern European Jews began to immigrate to the US in the amount of about 2 million people. Reasons were because of overpopulation, political strife, anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism basically means anti-Jewish or people who don't like Jewish people. And you'll hear that a lot with hate crimes. They'll say that person's an anti-Semite, which basically means that they don't like Jewish people. And of course, poverty. The second wave settled in poor areas of America. So we're talking about finding work in factories in the garment industry. Garment is just making clothing, cigar manufacturing, food production, and construction. So let's define Judaism. There are 5 million of the world's 13 million Jews live in the United States. The three main Jewish sects are Orthodox, Reform, and Conservative. However, there's also the Reconstructionist movement, which is considered the fourth, but it's also very low in numbers. So we just want to mention it, but they're not necessarily as high as those other three. So let's talk a little bit about these different sects. The Orthodoxy seeks to follow traditional laws that were given to Moses on Mount Sinai, including observing the Sabbath and dietary laws. The Reform does not believe the Torah was written by God, accepts the Bible was written by separate sources, and greater flexibility regarding personal observances. Less emphasis on commandments, yet retains values central to Judaism, with services to others being primary. So they're less by the book, but they're still religious spiritually, right? So that's a little bit different than the Orthodox, which takes, the traditional laws very, very seriously, word by word. There's also the Conservatives, grew out from the tensions between the Orthodoxy and the Reform. So people were a little, let's say, uncomfortable with what was going on between the two. So the conservative movement basically grew out of this, which is the conservative Jews believe God gave Torah to the Jews who interpret God's word within the context of both history and contemporary society. So they're saying is a little bit of both. They're basically picking a little bit of both, right? But they're also understanding that society changes over hundreds of years. And so we need to now interpret it as it's appropriate for today's time as well, but still respecting the culture and the history of their culture. All right, Reconstructionism, founded in 1922 by Mordecai Kaplan, sees Judaism as evolving religious civilization and do not believe in a personified deity active in history. So deity basically means a specific God, right? So again, they take the spirit of it, right? But they're not necessarily too word for word in that way. They introduced the idea of a bat mitzvah for girls, the idea of Jewish community centers, and the idea of haruvot, which are a small Jewish fellowship. So a bat mitzvah is basically for young Jewish girls when they are turning 13. The male version, which is very traditional, has existed. It's called a bar mitzvah. So that's B-A-R, and then the girls is bat, B-A-T. Okay, so traditional is Orthodox or conservative sometimes. Liberal or modern would be considered the Reform and the Reconstructionist, and conservative sometimes, because like you said before, conservatives kind of have a mix of the two, right? 35% identify with Reform, 18% identify with conservative, 10% identify with Orthodox, 6% identify as Reconstructionist or other Judaic movements. 3 out of 10 American Jews do not identify with any particular Jewish denomination. So that's always really interesting. If you have Jewish friends, feel free to ask them a little bit if they're willing to talk to you about it, because you'll get to see how what you're learning in class connects to the real world this way. So let's talk a little bit more about the Orthodoxy. Observe traditional religious beliefs and practices, guided by 613 mitzvahs or laws dictated by God to Moses on Mount Sinai concerning all aspects of life. Follows them strictly, including the dietary laws and honoring the Sabbath. Men and women sit separately in the synagogue, divided by a Makitza. Services is conducted in Hebrew. Gender influences behavior, so women are in the home rearing children, men are involved in the public realm, and they're also the ones in charge of religion, their spirituality and stuff like that as well. In Israel, Only Orthodox rabbis are considered official representatives of Judaism. It varies from modern to strictly traditional. So even within the Orthodox, there's modern and strictly traditional. Modern Orthodox is integrated into modern society while maintaining observance of the Halakha or the Jewish law. The Hasidim live separately and dress distinctively, sometimes called ultra-Orthodox, but that's not necessarily considered correct. Here is a link to a wedding. You see this picture right here is really beautiful. But as you can see, the bride-to-be is surrounded by thousands and thousands of men. The women are there as well, but they're actually separated by a very thin piece of fabric, I would say, or knitting or rope that's tied. So definitely I want you guys to look at it because it's just beautiful culture as well. Do I agree with everything? Obviously, no one's going to agree with anything ever 100%, right? But it is really beautiful to see the traditions that are being passed on, through photographs and stuff like that. The Yeshivish is Orthodox or not Hasidic nor modern, okay? Believe that G-D gave the whole Torah to Moses. G-D is basically God, but they don't spell it out because of religious beliefs. The whole Torah are the first 5 books of the Bible, which includes Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The oral Torah is an oral tradition interpreting and explaining the written Torah, believing that the Torah is true and has been unchanged. Hasidic Jews dress in their European ancestors, long black coats and hats, and the married women wear head coverings, like in this photo. And I'm sure there's different parts of Los Angeles that are, you'll see people when you drive by, let's say, or you're in that neighborhood, you'll see Hasidic Jews, parents walking their children or they're going somewhere, and they're wearing these long black coats. They also have hairstyles that are very unique. They have beards for the men anyways, and then for the women, they always have, something covering their heads if they are married. Reform Judaism, 1700s. Haskalah, or the Enlightenment, or as we talked about before, Jewish law. Jews who are interested in a modern view of their religion that would fit more easily into the world. So that means local languages during prayer instead of Hebrew. Okay, so again, that's very modern, right? We're moving over to America, so we'll talk about it in English instead. Or if we'll go over to, let's say, France, we will speak in French instead of Hebrew. Women are able to participate in public religious life as equal to men. Again, very modern that way. Women allowed to become rabbis and cantors. The Torah was seen as a divine inspiration, but not as a divinity or the actual word. Foundation to Reform Judaism is social justice, community service, and service to others. Now let's talk about conservative Judaism. Grew out of the tension between Orthodoxy and Reform in the 1800s, conserved certain rituals that were critical elements of Judaism while allowing those reform that were deemed necessary to make it appealing to the Jews of their time. So we're talking about kosher food laws, which are basically how food is prepared, how animals are killed for food, and what kind of foods to eat. Circumcision is basically cutting off of or removing the foreskin off of penises, and not working on the Shabbat. And Shabbat, we were talking about before, Sabbath is basically in the religion, God rested on the 7th day, and the same thing should happen with humans as well. We should rest one day where we basically rest and also celebrate, their religiosity. Opinion that reform went too far and too many rituals dismissed. Considerable variation among conservative synagogues. Some are more similar to Reform and some are more similar to Orthodox. So now let's talk about Reconstructionism. Began in the United States in 1922 by Rabbi Mordecai Kaplan, broke away from the conservative Jews, believed God was not an all-powerful being, but the power of our ethics and belief for good. They maintained the dietary laws that we were talking about before, Hebrew in the liturgy, Men in yarmulkes or kippas or skull caps. So that's like that little round hat that you see some Jewish people put on, that the men wear on the top of their heads. That's also known as yarmulke or a kippah or a skull cap. Um, Judaism was an evolving civilization based on religion and the sum of its ethical teachings, literature, history, ideas, and ways of life. Kaplan rejected the belief that a Messiah would come to save the Jews. So again, someone to come save. So he's removing the God part of it in that sense, right? Believes that we are humans have a belief of being good and are ethical. 100 synagogues are Reconstructionist worldwide, while there are 900 Reform synagogues and 750 synagogues who are conservative. So you can see again, Reconstructionism is not necessarily as popular. The Reform, because again, it's considered the more modern one of the group that we've been talking about, and then of course the conservative, which is kind of like a mix between that and the Orthodox. Now let's talk about the meaning of being Jewish. The Pew Research Center surveyed of U.S. Jews in 2013, 70,000 respondents in the U.S., and of that, 3,475 Jews did a long interview. 4.2 million Jews in the U.S., which makes up about 2% of the population. 1.1 million Jews identify as being raised Jewish, but does not identify with being Jewish. So I'm sure some of you guys are familiar with that with your own religions, right? You were raised Catholic, but you're not Catholic anymore, right? But you acknowledge the fact that you were raised Catholic. 6 to 8 out of 10 say that being Jewish is mainly a matter of ancestry or culture. So that they're saying basically is they acknowledge that their history, their family are Jewish people, but it's not necessarily a high priority for them today, but they still acknowledge it, right? 7 out of 10 of US Jews say that remembering the Holocaust is an essential part of being, or of what being Jewish means to them. And of course, I'm sure we've all heard of the Holocaust, a time where in Europe, basically, they killed a lot of Jewish people, put them in concentration camps, starved them, worked them to death, tested them. It's a horrible, horrible, disturbing time in the global history of humans. And so we always teach it because it's such a big lesson to learn about how awful humans can also be. Religious Jews, 49% care about Israel. Non-religious Jews, 23% care about Israel. So again, that is of course the one of the areas that is considered the homeland, and then there's always fights between them and the Palestinians. And so if you want to, you can again do more research on that. This is not a class specifically on the Jewish religion or anything like that, or Jewish people. But again, it's very interesting, very political. It's still happening to this day. Lots and lots of bombings and stuff like that. That is very political, unfortunately. But the people there don't necessarily care about this. They might think it's not necessarily such a big deal anymore, but politically it is actually a very well-known fight for this area. Show or the Holocaust. I've hyperlinked here the Museum of Tolerance. If you live in Los Angeles, you might have heard of the Museum of Tolerance when you're driving on the freeway. And basically, I sent you the link here. And actually, because of the pandemic, they actually have a bunch of tours online. So you can actually go in there and learn more about people of Jewish descent at the Museum of Tolerance. 6 million Jewish babies, children, and adult men and women were murdered during the Holocaust. And it's not the first genocide of Jews, right? So 6 million Jewish people of all ages were killed. That is so many people, and it's so sad. Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass. Jewish people and their homes, synagogues, and businesses were attacked and destroyed by Nazis on November 9th and 10th in 1938. U.S. President Roosevelt condemned Kristallnacht, but also did not let Jews immigrate to America en masse during this period. 17-year-old Herschel Greenspan shot a German diplomat, Ernest von Rath, for transporting his parents to Poland. 30,000 young Jewish men were arrested and sent to German concentration camps. So again, I'm sure many of you guys have seen Schindler's List, which is a movie about the Holocaust. It's very sad, very disturbing, but really necessary to watch to learn more about it because it creates a dialogue. And you know, you should also read the books and stuff. That's just a movie, right? But hopefully that will encourage you to do more research after that. Immigration Act of 1924 provided immigration visas for 2% of the immigration population. Now let's talk a little bit about the demographics. Jewish people live in the Northeast, 43%, so that's the majority of the people. South is 23%, the West is 23%, and the Midwest is 11%. The largest population of Jewish people live in New York, obviously because of the Northeast. There's about 750,000. Miami is 535,000, and often a lot of people who retire, the Jewish people who retire because they're older, will move down to Florida. That's why there's such a huge flux of people into Florida. Los Angeles, California, our hometown, 450,000 people. Philadelphia, 350,000. Chicago, Illinois is 248,000. High levels of educational attainment, 58% of them are college graduates. 28% have postgraduate degrees. 25% have household incomes exceeding $150,000. 20% have incomes of less than $30,000. 4 out of 10 Jewish adults say they live in a household where at least one person is a member of a synagogue. So you can see how their spirituality and religious beliefs are very important to them, and this is why they belong to a synagogue. Now let's talk about social, psychological, and physical health issues. So we already have discussed microaggressions in a previous chapter. There was a YouTube video called microaggressions are like mosquito bites. If you have not seen it or you don't remember it, you want to have a quick, really easy definition and understanding of what a microaggression is, please click on that link. It's hyperlinked to it, and you will be refreshed. But let's just talk a little bit about the definition according to this textbook, which is that it's a commonplace verbal, behavioral, and environmental indignities that are hostile, whether intentional or unintentional, and communicate put-downs that have harmful psychological and physiological impact on targeted individuals or groups. Okay, so it's the things that people say or do that might be purposeful to hurt someone or not. So that's the thing about microaggressions is sometimes it sounds like a compliment and they believe it's a compliment, but it also reminds people that they're talking to that they don't belong necessarily, or don't forget that you are a foreigner here. An accumulation of microaggressions reduces self-efficacy and increases feelings of vulnerability and powerlessness, anger, sadness, hypervigilance, which basically means kind of feeling like you need to do things, maybe like correct things immediately, like you have to do right, you feel like you need to do it, although sometimes it's too much and it's inappropriate. And of course, isolation from others. So when you hear a lot of microaggressions over and over and over again, you start to not feel like you can do things anymore because you hear it all the time and you start to believe it. One of the common stereotypes is that the Jewish lawyer is a pushy person. He's aggressive, powerful, miserly, and wealthy. Again, these are some very similar words that we saw in the beginning of this chapter. And again, this is just playing on the stereotypes, and we want to learn to recognize it and then also to then stop it. Jews were the first model minority, now they're Asians, ascriptions of intelligence. So there is a thing called JAPS, J-A-P-S, which I actually don't encourage you to just say to people. I'm just reading it off of this right here, but it stands for Jewish American Princesses, kind of like that spoiled girl, that rich girl that gets everything. I hyperlinked it to a couple of girls who are Jewish, or ladies who are Jewish, who kind of joking around about it. It has a negative term to it, but there's also a loving term to it as well, right? So I just want you to be aware of it and not confuse JAPS with Japanese people, but it actually stands for Jewish American Princesses, right? Just to see how it can be made fun of, but it also can sometimes be a put down, and to be aware of that. Number of genetic diseases exist for people of Jewish heritage. The Ashkenazi Jews, 1 in 2 Ashkenazi Americans carry one of 38 Jewish genetic diseases. The carrier screening is dependent upon country of origin, and all Jewish and interfaith couples are encouraged to seek preconception genetic counseling. And the reason why is because they want to know whether or not the child that they have, if they decide to, will potentially have a specific type of genetic disease. And think about that before having children, because it can also be very emotional, traumatic, expensive, just sad overall, potentially, not necessarily, right? So again, genetic counseling is encouraged. Cultural orientations and values. Centrality of modern Israel, as we've talked about before, Israel is considered a very important sacred place. Hebrew, the irreplaceable language of Jewish expression. And you'll probably hear people say things and you're like, oh, is that Hebrew? Um, and stuff like that. Devotion to the ideal of Kal Israel, which is the fractured totality of Jewish existence and the ultimate significance of everyday single Jew. So again, the devotion, this is again part of their cultural ideas, right? Defining the role of the Torah and the reshaping of Judaism. So understanding about the modern times that we live in, and then how does the Torah apply to us today? And of course, they also want to study the Torah, the governance of Jewish life by the Halakha, which we talked about was Jewish laws. So we're talking about having faith, being a belief in God, humor, remembrance, high holidays, educational attainment, social justice, honoring tradition, progress, communication patterns influenced by authority, age, and gender, especially in Orthodoxy, and of course, a simple burial. So again, cultural orientations and values that you want to be aware about. So let's talk a little bit about the implications of mental health professionals. Non-Jews are encouraged to be familiar with the holidays, Yom Kippur, the Sabbath of Sabbaths, Day of Atonement. Atonement basically means a day where you ask for forgiveness for the things that you have done wrong. Planning calendar and excusing absences from schools and work as needed for observances. They do have their own set of very important holidays, and they will let you know that they will need to take those days off for religious observances, and that you will respect that and comply with it, and not complain or not hate them or anything like that. Understand that this is part of their culture, and you move along. And of course, really need to understand the history of anti-Semitism or the hatred of Jewish people, right? There's a lot of it, unfortunately, in America. It's actually very, very popular with people who are part of the Nazi, neo-Nazis and KKK, okay?